Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes to let others join, and then we'll begin today's discussion. Okay, I see some folks trickling in, so we're just going to give it one more minute. Okay, we're ready to begin. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest installment of our K12 special webinars, Redesigning Education, Accelerating Innovative Approaches with Federal Dollars. My name is Jessica Au. I'm a Senior Policy Analyst on our K12 team at the Hunt Institute. And for those who are unfamiliar with the Hunt Institute, we were founded by four-term North Carolina Governor Jim Hunt, and we serve as a resource expert for policymakers on education issues across the education continuum through both in-person and virtual convenings, research, and other forms of technical assistance. So before getting the conversation started, I just wanted to provide a couple of logistical remarks. So we'll start the discussion with about a 30-minute moderated conversation with our panelists, and then we'll pivot to a Q&A with our audience. And so if you have any burning questions that come up throughout the discussion, please feel free to submit them using the Q&A feature on the bottom of your Zoom screen. And then we'll do our best to collect those and compile them and then address them during the Q&A portion. We're also going to record this conversation. The recording is going. And then in the next couple of days, we'll post that on our YouTube channel. So feel free to check that out later. And we also encourage you to join us on Twitter, where you can participate in the conversation using the hashtag COVID constituency. And we'll also be live tweeting from our Twitter account at HuntK12Ed. So we have a great conversation ahead of us. And we're so appreciative of our wonderful panelists today for making time to really share their expertise around innovative programs, strategies, and approaches that they've seen in states and districts using federal relief funding. And so without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for today, former West Virginia Governor and Congressman Bob Wise. And thank you so much for joining us, Governor Wise, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Jessica, and to the Hunt Institute. It's a privilege to partner with you and also with this panel at a very, very timely moment for education decision makers, both in practice and in policy. So let me quickly give a little bit of background on the COVID constituency work with the Hunt Institute that I've had the privilege of partnering on. The premise is that coming out of COVID and during COVID, what we've experienced in this country is the single greatest shared experience since World War II, particularly as it affects education. 96 to 98 million young people from birth to graduate school, add in another 60 million caregivers in some respect, grandparents, parents, and so on. And what we have is, and then everyone to some extent, whether a week or 18 months, was shut in and locked down and had to adapt very quickly. What the Hunt Institute has done is to work with support from the Carnegie Corporation of New York. What the Hunt Institute has done is extensive surveying and analysis of surveys to further substantiate that there is a growing movement that wants significant changes in education and will support them. And there are also some common areas as well of concern in this COVID constituency: much greater appreciation of teachers and the role of teaching, concern about quality teaching, much greater awareness, off the charts to be frank with you, on mental health needs, and not only for the children that were in their houses, but also in the schools, also mental health of parents and teachers. Much greater awareness of the needs of technology, and then too, personalized learning, the need to have education that's much more tailored to the individual needs and learning recovery needs of children, and of course, the emphasis as well on workforce development. So these are all areas that this is a nonpartisan constituency. It's not interested in which part, any political party. It wants things done. So, and it wants finally children, it wants to be back to normal, but it's very clear it wants a new normal. Each of the people that's on here is very much been committed to that in their previous occupations and now in their current policy making roles. And let me just say, the COVID constituency also, there's this unique moment. There's a crisis coming. The COVID moment has created that. There's a commitment, so crisis commitment, and putting it in my most straightforward terms, there's cash. There are federal dollars that we will be talking about, whether through the American Rescue Plan and some other sources, sometimes called ESSER, Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Funds, and then many states, and Illinois is one of them, and many states have stepped up and put their own dollars in as well. So crisis, commitment, cash, what gets done with it now? And we have three experts and people very much involved in making this moment all that it can be. And we have Dr. Ernesto Mateos, the Chief Education Officer of the Illinois State Board of Education, and he's on the ground making it happen. Dr. Jessica Carterjean, Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development for the United States Department of Education, and Nick Simmons, Senior Advisor for School Reopening and Recovery, Office of the Secretary in U.S. Department of Education. So if I could, Nick, if I could start with you. As Senior Advisor for School Reopening and Recovery, you've guided and partnered with states across the country, assisting them as they navigate what is a historic level of funding. $122 billion simply with the American Rescue Plan, ESSER dollars, additional funds. So $122 billion there, and other sources of funding, historic one time, I believe one time. What spending trends have you seen nationally, and what are some examples of innovative and impactful state or local programs or strategies that you've seen districts, school leaders using these education dollars?
Thank you, Governor, and thanks to the Hunt Institute and Jessica for having me here today, along with my colleague Jessica Carterjean. So we're really encouraged, and I think it's such an exciting time to be in the K12 space. I think a lot of it is to what you said, Governor. There's cash. It's very rare to, for those of us who've been working at the state and local level to just be flush as an administrator or principal superintendent with money to be able to design and create programs that you might have always wanted to implement or that you thought would be a great intervention to support students, but just didn't have the support to do it. And so we have been tracking in several ways how the money is being spent. At a very high level, I can say that the biggest bucket of spending has gone to new staff or retaining current staff. So about 30% of all the dollars, which is about $30 billion, has gone to staffing some way or another, retaining, upskilling, professional development, or hiring new staff. The next bucket, about another quarter, so about $27 billion, has gone to what's bucketed as academic recovery. And that's from everything from tutoring, summer school, extending the school year, kind of you name it, everything to support students and helping them catch up. And then we have about $7 billion specifically on mental health for students. And so a lot of that mental health is also being covered in the staffing bucket for new counselors and mental health professionals. But beyond that, $7 billion on mental health of students. A few other buckets on things like facilities and tech to keep schools safe and improve technology. But that's sort of the broad lay of the land. And where we're really, really excited, and we think a lot of innovation is happening, And I can touch on a few of these categories and happy to continue to dive in throughout our session. But I think first, because we're in the season, summer learning has been really inspiring to see what has been happening and how districts have been using the money. So for those who don't know, right now, 60% of the achievement gap is estimated to be caused by what happens over the summer. It is such a source of wild inequality in our US system. And previously, only about 57% of districts were able to offer some sort of free summer programming, usually in wealthier districts. Last summer and continued this summer, 90% of districts offered some sort of free summer learning. So it went from 57 to 90%. So it's almost near universal. We want to get up to 100%, but we're climbing up there. So you see things like the city of Cleveland, which its rate of attendance in summer program went up 6 times. You see New York City is offering what they're calling, New York City's calling their summer youth improvement, which for 100,000 new students in New York City. West Virginia put in $33 million of grants to support summer programming. There's a lot of really cool and fun programming you're seeing. It's not just school, but lots of camps, sports activities, nature programs, museum visits, etc., that are combining the fun and the engagement with the learning. I know my time is running up, but I'd love to talk a little bit more about tutoring when we get a chance, because there's some really cool and exciting things happening there as well.
We're coming back to you on that.
All
so,
right.
Dr. Carter-Jean, you're the Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Office of Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development, and you've been spearheading a lot of the work helping states and districts use ARP funding, American Rescue Plan, to address critical priorities, such as some of the ones that Nick mentioned, the teaching labor shortages and student mental health. What policies, programs, and investments can state and local leaders pursue to address these issues?
Great, thank you. And echoing what Nick said, it's really an honor to be here today with you all, and really excited to share some of the work that's coming out of the department. But most of what it is a reflection of what we're seeing at the state and local level. And so we have tried from day one to be responsive to what we are hearing are the needs of states and districts. And part of that has been, how do we use these ARP dollars in ways that are effective, not only in meeting the short-term challenges, but really addressing some of the long-term challenges that we see. And so while Nick has spoke a bit about how the dollars are being spent, I just want to take a few minutes to share kind of 5 of the strategies that we've been really focusing on and making sure that we're providing a strong technical assistance and guidance around, but also elevating the states and districts where this work has been long underway or maybe new in response to the pandemic. So the first is really meeting students' basic needs, meeting students' social, emotional, and mental health needs. We know from a lot of the research on the science of learning that while adverse experiences can have profound effects on students, we know that learning environments and conditions can be designed in ways that help students overcome these effects and thrive. So, the pandemic created a lot of stress and anxiety for students and their families, as well as other events, over the last number of years. And we know that there are ways to design teaching and learning that help address and overcome some of those challenges. And that as we think about academic recovery, it is impossible to disconnect that from meeting students' social, emotional, and mental health needs, that those are really the foundation, and also that they're interconnected. So as we're thinking about how we design teaching and learning, that we have these opportunities for students to develop those interpersonal and interpersonal skills and work closely with their peers and develop, resiliency and other, we think traits that will really help them through challenging times. And so for us, we've never kind of separated social, emotional, mental health needs with our objective around closing opportunity and achievement gaps. One of the things that we saw that was even made worse by COVID was those key transitions for students. We've been thinking a lot about those students who their first year in kindergarten or in middle or high school might have been entirely remote, or their last year, and how we're supporting them through those key transitions between those stages. And so have looked to a lot of the research on early warning indicator systems that help track where students are very early on, their attendance, their assignment completion, credit accumulation, grades, discipline instances, so that we're not waiting till the end of the year, but we're looking at data, every 6 to 8 weeks and getting a sense of how are we, who are the students that might need additional support, in what ways, and where we are providing interventions, are they being effective? And summer is a great opportunity as well to provide some of those summer bridge programs so that we make sure that our kids, students successfully transition into middle school, into high school, which we know can be particularly challenging. The third area that we've been really focusing on is on tailored acceleration. While there may be an inclination to go more towards remediation, we think the research is pretty clear around the benefits of focusing on tailored acceleration that provides or combines high quality teacher-led instruction with other instructional approaches, so that all students don't need to learn the same thing at the same time, but are held to the same standards, and they can access the most essential building blocks to make that pathways. I know, Governor Wise, you spoke around personalization. So very much that approach where we are meeting students where they're at and giving them that tailored information and instruction and support that they need to make progress. We've seen a number of states do this well. In Massachusetts, they have acceleration academies in the Lawrence public school system, a Delaware strategy to accelerate learning, where again, we've really seen that focus on not tracking students or kind of dumbing down what they're learning, but really supporting their growth aligned to grade level standards and making that progression. Fourth, which Nick has mentioned, again, the benefits of evidence-based tutoring practices. Not all tutoring is the same, but the research has been pretty consistent that when you use trained educators as tutors, or highly trained tutors who may not be educators, when you provide high dosage tutoring each week for, at least 3 times a week for at least 30 to 50 minutes, ideally during the school day, but it can be after the school day. And when it's aligned with in-classroom success, so your evidence-based core curriculum or program, that is where we see the most gains for students. And then finally, the use of high quality diagnostic and formative assessments. It's really important that teachers have that roadmap and that real full understanding of where their students are, where they are struggling, where additional supports are needed, and also have greater insight into how they are thinking and how they are learning, and more opportunities for students to demonstrate their thinking. And so building professional capacity is a big part of these efforts, but all of these things that we've been focusing in on, we think that's just what good teaching and learning looks like, and we need to use these resources to double down or triple down on those investments in the years to come.
So thank you. And Dr. Mateus, these are the federal dollars, and it's been pointed out they're record and historic. You're the one who actually at the state level has to work with the districts to make sure they're being spent adequately and well, and in a concerted way, because it is just so vitally important that these dollars not only help us recover, but also help us restore what I call moving from triage to transition to ultimately we hope to transformation. So could you talk some as Chief Education Officer for the Illinois State Board of Education, how you are working with your departments, your districts, your other stakeholders to make critical decisions on allocating these ESSER dollars, but also how you perhaps are merging them with your state dollars?
So just happy to be here. Thank you for having me here. But one thing that Jessica mentioned in her list of 5 was the STL dollars. And so in the state of Illinois, we've put in over $86 million for SEL, knowing that if a student is not feeling secure, safe, and stable at school, they're not going to be ready to learn or engage in learning. So for us, the impetus starts with community input, right? What's the feedback from
Is
our
that, excuse me,
students?
is that your community partnerships program?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
It's the
yeah.
community partnerships. Sorry, Governor. It's the community partnerships program where, because of input from students, parents, and teachers across the state, we decided to allocate, the superintendent to allocate over $86 million in community partnerships. Research shows, and again, I'm not saying anything new that Jessica has not previously stated, that children's social and emotional development is foundational to school readiness and success. In order to successfully address the academic impact of the pandemic, we must address the SEL impacts that have been exacerbated, right, with students. And so we awarded 136 community partnership grants totaling about $86.4 million to support the mental health of students and educators. The model really is focused on strengthening the relationships between community health workers and school districts and schools. And so, for example, in the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, the university's School of Social Work brings together the Mohammed Seymour School District, Mohammed Area Youth Club, and a local mental health provider, the Rock Counseling Group, to utilize interconnected systems framework to address the mental health through a combination of programming and supports integrated across school and community sites. Another grantee, Paris Union School District 95, which is a rural school district in Illinois, partners with 3 human service agencies and hire 2 full-time professional staff to address the shortage of mental health professionals. It also added a telehealth service component and provides a universal mental health screening for every student and mental health professional training for teachers. Telehealth is especially important in our rural communities, but really for anyone who can't, get to the medical facility in person. Now they can use a telehealth system to be able to get what they need. In addition to the community partnership programs, we launched 7 social emotional learning hubs. And we have 7 because our regional offices of education across the state are in 6 areas. So all districts are in the 6 regional offices areas, plus Chicago as its own, as a 3rd district. As the 3rd largest district in the United States. And so in the hubs, we are providing resources and provide professional learning for emotional and behavioral health and trauma-informed practices. This originally started with the Center for Childhood Resilience at Lurie's Children's Hospital. First, we offered all educators in the state free virtual training to better understand the impact of trauma on children and adolescents and themselves. And over 6,000 educators at the end of last year had taken us up and done this training. And then we brought the Resilience Education to Advanced Community Healing, or REACH program, to approximately 50 schools. And now that has increased to an additional 200 schools. And part of their work is to assemble a multidisciplinary team and conduct a trauma assessment to pinpoint gaps, and then develop a trauma responsive action plan to address these gaps within their schools. Really, the long-term hope is that each of the 852 districts and over 4,000 schools in the state of Illinois will have a trauma team in their schools made up of variety from community and school to continue addressing long-term the trauma that our kids come to school with. So it's not just pandemic related, it's pre-pandemic and it'll be post-pandemic as well. Just trying to really be creative with the ESSER funds to get our educators capacity up to level to deal with the trauma that our kids currently have.
Sounds like what you're doing, as a quick follow-up, sounds like a lot of what you're doing is what the state superintendent in Missouri called at a recent Hunt Institute forum silo busting, in the sense of COVID forced us to bust silos in order to provide basic services during the most extreme periods of COVID. The key is not rebuilding those silos, but redesigning how we are delivering services.
That's correct. I think that the future here in Illinois and across the country, it's how well we can tool our staff, tool our kids to deal with their continual stress caused by the pandemic, right? And life in general. Because if we can't help them do that, then you're not going to get to a point where they can be productive citizens and provide us with quality services that we need.
So to all our panelists, it occurred to me in preparation for this yesterday that we're really at a midway point in some ways, because the ESSER funding, as I recall, it has to be obligated by September of 2024. There's some other additional ARP funding that runs a little later, but the ESSER, the ARP education ESSER dollars. So at this point where most of our districts are out of the triage stage, they're in their trying to get back to some semblance of normal stage, but how do we move to transformation? In other words, what one chancellor of a major system said, I'm not interested in coming back to normal as we were before COVID. I want to make sure that we're better than we were before. What do you think are the steps that are critical for state and district leaders to take during this time, particularly as they're looking at obligating the final tranches of their federal dollars to move to this transformational stage to support the long-term improvements that Dr. Mateus, for instance, was just talking about for education systems? So I'm happy to, whomever wants to jump on that one first. If you don't jump, then I'm going to point. Dr. Mateus, could I start with you, because you really teed this one up?
Yeah, I think that three components for moving to transformation: we have to be strategic, we have to be equitable, and we have to think of sustainability, right? Because as you've mentioned, Governor, September 30th of 2024 is coming. What are we going to do to continue some of these programs that we have currently and that are showing promise via data evidencing success? And so for us, strategic, equitable, sustainable, we did an analysis of school districts that actually increased academic proficiency from 2020 to 2021. And I'll give you just two examples in the three principles that they employed. One was supporting high need students and focused on best practices. Nick mentioned and he'll talk about a high impact tutoring, and I'll leave that to you, Nick, later on, but that's one of the focuses, right? The second one was increased collaboration time for teachers, and then lastly, providing one-on-one intervention. So Morton Grove School District 70 saw a 35.5% increase in sixth grade students meeting or exceeding standards in English language arts. The district sought community input on its instructional plan, which led to smaller class sizes, one-on-one technology, and focused professional development. And then when we asked, the district attributed its success to the implementation of 1 hour a day collaborative time for instructional teams to co-plan and engage in professional inquiry focused on student learning. The second example that I'll give you is Mascta Community Unit School District 19, which saw an 80.9% increase in sixth grade students meeting or exceeding standards in our state assessment IAR math test. The pandemic provided the district the opportunity to improve consistency and depth of instruction across its classrooms. And so the district worked to identify essential learning standards. In the state of Illinois, we brought together over 50 educators from across the state. We took the learning standards that were, and then we coined priority learning standards, those standards that we deemed essential, to student mastery and lifelong learning. And so the allusion to that there is great. And then finally, DuPage High School District 88 saw a 13% increase in student meeting or exceeding standards on their SAT. From the start of the school year, the district prioritized in-person instruction for high need students, including English learners and students with disability. The district provided in-depth person and online tutoring, made significant investments in technology for remote instruction, and conducted home visits and concentrated on social emotional needs. So when you're talking about moving to transformation, for us, those three things, strategic, right? What's the data showing, and where can you find the partnerships with the data showing effectiveness of implementation and student outcomes? And then equitable, how can we do that? I'll give you a quick example, and later on I'll talk about it. When we were talking about our learning renewal for high impact tutoring, SEL that I've already talked about, interim assessments, as well as bridging and transition, and Jessica had mentioned like the high school transition to post-secondary success, but also for us, the pre-K kindergarten that missed out on school. We first took a look at like the data indicating the needs, and then we followed through with providing this to the whole state. And so those are some of the things that we're doing to move us hopefully to transformative practices across the state.
So thank you. And as we turn back to the federal side of it, an observation, I spent most of my career, 24 years in public life, dealing with natural disasters, of which COVID, I think, is certainly would have qualified as one of the most extended. Often when you're in the midst of trying to dig out of the rubble, it's hard to be reflecting on how you transform the community that just got decimated. And so I guess some of my question, Nick and Dr. Carter-Jean, some of my question would be, my observation is that there are a number of states and districts across the country that probably are still struggling to spend the ESSER dollars in the way that they really want to, and particularly within the deadline. What are some of the biggest challenges standing between states and districts and obligating these funds, do you think? So Nick, do you want to jump in on that one?
Sure. Well, I would say, I don't think we've seen a huge problem in terms of spending, of getting the dollars out the door. I think, if anything, there's always, can we get more? I think one problem has of course been the teacher shortages. So, a lot of districts want to be able to spend and hire new professionals, new teachers, but they're just not able to find them. And Jessica has been really spearheading that for the department. And I'd love for her to share some of what she's learning, but I can just quickly share, I think, two systems that will really persist. And I think Dr. Matias talked a lot about different programs that are going to shift culture, that are going to silo bust, which I think is super important. I mean, how great is it when we're talking about school safety now and thinking about what's really going to help the overall culture of the school? We're not talking about police officers, we're talking about social workers and mental health professionals. That's new. 15 years ago, that wasn't really on the radar. So I do think there's a cultural shift that's happening, which is great. I think that two areas which will always persist. One is all the upskilling and new training and professional development that's happening. I'm still relying on professional development trainings that I got 15 years ago. And those are really worth their weight in gold. And so we're seeing a lot of money going towards staff upskilling in things like social emotional learning. That social studies teacher that's been teaching for 35 years, and really maybe that wasn't ever in the toolbox before. How do you bring social emotional learning and a more sort of skilled emotional approach into your classroom? And we're seeing it really revolutionize school communities. Spending 5-6 days a year to go through some really intensive training that could only happen with these dollars. So I think all that upskilling and let alone in all the tech upgrades that are happening, really breaking down barriers of what can be taught in school and how long can the school day last with new tech solutions. So I think that all of that is going to persist. And then the last thing I'll say is, Dr. Matias said it a bunch, and I was smiling because this actually isn't really the norm, which is using data to inform your interventions. And those are investments that we're seeing now that will really persist. And so you're seeing states like, Guilford County, North Carolina has been getting a lot of credit for its tutoring program. And they've been bringing in, 500 new tutors, and they're paying for that with ESSER dollars. But what goes a little under the radar is the way that they designed the program was based on a whole new algorithm that uses data from student absences, suspensions, and grades. And they've never had that system before. And so they're putting in a new way of building systems to target and pull and aggregate which students need the most help. And those will persist. It's like an infrastructure upgrade. And so it's really great to see that happen across school districts. And I think that could last a decade or more with a sort of a one-time investment. And so I think it's upskilling and these data upgrades that that are great and we hope persist.
Jessica or Dr. Carter-Jean.
Thanks. Yeah, I was going to start with something else, but I did want to build off of Nick's point and Dr. Matias around that use of data. It can also be really used to inform professional development or learning, right? So if you were seeing a subset of teachers struggling in one area and others excelling, how you create those professional learning communities around that so that teachers support each other. Was really excited, Dr. Matias, when you were talking about professional learning communities, of giving teachers that time to learn from each other and look at the data and examine it. And those who have certain strengths serving as leaders in that area and others who are struggling, being able to get that targeted support. I was going to speak about a few things, but I will focus on the teacher piece because that is the best investment that you can make is in your people and in building that capacity so that if they are learning how to, as Nick said, teach differently, get additional skills, the dollars run out, but that capacity is still there. And, you know, do not want to understate the challenges that many districts are finding themselves in and attracting teachers to the profession. And so want to highlight a few things that it's a both and investing in your pipeline into the profession and then supporting your teachers currently in the profession. We know that our shortages are both a pipeline issue and a retention issue. We've released a number of fact sheets and guidance documents that have shown how you can not only use your ESSER dollars, but your GEAR, your governor's emergency relief dollars, and your higher ed, your HERF dollars, to support partnerships between states, districts, and IHEs around a strong and diverse pipeline into the profession. So scaling up those high quality teacher preparation programs and providing financial incentives and supports for teachers. So loan forgiveness, service scholarship programs. So you can use your ARP dollars to provide certain loan forgiveness or service scholarships that might have a finite period of time. But if you commit to teaching in this school for an X number of years, we will provide a stipend or funds towards your debt load. And so we really think that pipeline piece, while it might take years to see the benefits of that, are particularly helpful. We've seen some districts use their teacher candidates and teacher prep programs to serve as tutors, provide additional supports to their current teachers, because we know that they have had a lot on their plate. That's also another understatement over the last few years to bring that additional support in. We also have highlighted ways that you can use ARP dollars to support your current teachers. And so while at the federal level, we can't do anything to change teacher salaries, some of those retention bonuses or stipends might provide a little bit of additional cushion or support. Bringing in volunteers, other staff to help support students and teachers go a long way. The secretary has every opportunity he has to call on states, particularly those that are seeing budget surpluses, to provide their teachers a livable and competitive wage. While we can talk about the importance of working conditions and resources and supports, and those are all incredibly important, we have to pay our teachers a competitive and livable wage. That is at the foremost of all our efforts. And then finally, the last thing I'll say, and I'll put a link in the chat, is we have heard the same concerns. Well, what happens when ARP dollars run out, particularly around supporting our teachers? So we released, call it a fact sheet, but it's 9 pages. So it's a bit longer than a fact sheet of all the existing federal resources that you can use to support your teachers from pipeline through retention to sustain those investments once ARP does eventually run out. So I'm happy to drop that in the chat.
So you just touched on something that I recall one time state legislators criticizing me for a program saying these are one-time dollars. And my response was one-time dollars are always better than no-time dollars, and the importance of doing something good with them. So I do want to follow up on moving past ESSER for just a moment. because, and Nick, maybe you're the one to address this too, is I have been struck by the fact that in addition to the ARP dollars for education, there the Congress also appropriated, and the president aggressively fought for, $350 billion in state and local federal relief funds. I'll skip the acronym. But these have incredible flexibility and can be used to backstop a lot of the efforts that schools are. Are you seeing examples where, and Dr. Mateus as well, are you seeing examples where the counties, the cities, and the state also gets a lion's share of this, are able to work together, busting silos once again, to put these state and local relief dollars to work also supporting the education system, whether it's workforce development, mental health facilities, a lot of it can be used as well for technology access.
I'm happy to jump in on that because it's one of our, I'm glad you mentioned it. It's one of our favorite techniques out there to catalyze some of the best programs we've seen. Yep. With all the love and admiration to our superintendents and school boards, sometimes a governor can just act more quickly, or a mayor. And in the early days of COVID, those were the first big chunks of money to move. In Indiana, the governor did a huge $100 million summer learning program, had it out the door within like 2 to 3 months of ARP being passed. Those were grants out to districts to really prioritize their partnership with community-based organizations. So if you wanted access to grant money, you sort of had to apply with your Boys and Girls Club or your YMCA. And that was a great program. Arizona, Governor Ducey did the same thing. And so there've been great examples of that. There's been mayors, the Great Summer Program in New York I mentioned, that was actually from Mayor Adams first. So that's certainly true. I love that you mentioned workforce. That's another area. The governor of Connecticut put forth a $70 million new workforce training called Career Connect, with the CT capitalized for Connecticut, which was a $70 million program that very much incentivized high schools working with community colleges on pathway programs. In New York City, again, in addition to just the summer school, there was a pledge for 100,000 youth summer job programs. So we love this tactic because it just takes all the funding that exists and you can double it with the state money. And then if you want to go for the triple crown, bring in a county or city money as well, and you can really have some incredible funded programs. And that state and local relief, those dollars get an extra 2 years before they expire. So, it really brings together the different sort of tiers of our system.
Anybody else want to, Dr. Mateus, any observations on this from the state level?
We continue to have those discussions, especially when you're talking about CET and education to careers, right? We need to grow our own teachers. And how do you do that? Workforce development combined with what we're trying to do through CTE programs, like Nick was stating, gives us the best venue for creating those pathways and partnerships with our community colleges, our district, our schools, for our kids to be able to achieve that. We have an RFP out for a third grant opportunity. In the first two, we have over 7,000 students currently who are in a pathway to go to college to become teachers. And so if we can get the majority of them to go to college and stay with their major instead of switching off, then long-term, that'll be one of the solutions for our teacher shortage problem here.
And Jessica, you spoke about the long-term aspect of this and the importance, I think, of trying to build that. Well, it's both building a pipeline and a support system, isn't it? Have any other suggestions that we ought to be looking at for starting that process?
Yeah, I think the pipeline beginning as early as high school, and creating some grow your own programs begin with strong CTE pathways in high schools, which Perkins dollars can be used to support. So again, highlighting where these funds can be sustained after ARP, so that our high school students can graduate, high school with a number of credits under their belt. We've seen a number of 2+2 grow your own programs. So those 2 years of the last 2 years of high school and community college, and then transferring to a 4-year institution. And also, and Nick had touched upon this, of also really tapping into our great staff already working at schools and with students. So our paraprofessionals, other support staff, those who've worked in, after school programs or summer programs that know what it is like to be around students all day. And have those dispositions and the skills, and need that, that those additional certifications as well. The other thing that we've also encouraged, not only the pipeline though for those who are working near and within schools, but also schools might be fine on their current, their K-6 teachers or their high school teachers, but have shortages in special education, bilingual education, STEM or CTE, that using ARP dollars to cover the cost of those additional certifications. Often for teachers, that might mean moving up in the pay scale when they have those additional certifications, but also giving them opportunities for professional growth and leadership and development, and covering the cost of those. And so really thinking creatively around whether it is a high school student, a paraprofessional, or a current teacher, how are we making it easier for them to enter the profession and stay in the profession? And while much of it is compensation, also giving them the flexibility in their schedules to do that work as well. We've also seen the last thing is creative approaches to staffing. So for our early career teachers, doing more team teaching, thinking about how you're assigning teachers and partnering them together. Again, every teacher has areas of growth and areas of expertise, and really tapping into those resources as well.
So each of you has mentioned the data several times, actually. So a question that's come in is, how should education leaders be thinking about and collecting data as it relates to their ESSER spending? How can they use it to identify whether their funds are being spent effectively, and also to help guide their future decisions?
I think we're all being polite. So I'm like, who's going to jump in? I can go first. I'll be very quick, and I would love for Nick and Dr. Matisse to share as well. One thing that we think is important is the frequency within which you look at the data, and whether it is partnering with maybe an IHE or a research institute to help you understand the data, analyze the data, but that frequency, so that it's not the end of the year that you're looking back, but how are you looking at the right data points at the right time? And then it is critically important to disaggregate and cross-tabulate your data, so that we know who the interventions are. Maybe some interventions are being particularly effective for our multilingual learners or our students with disabilities, but really getting a sense of the impact that the different interventions and strategies are having on different subgroups of students, and where you might need to adjust course on some of them.
Totally agree with Jessica. The thing I'll add, in our state last week, we finished our Power BI ESSER data dashboard. We had an Excel one up. Now we have that, where it gives you all of the information that you would want for ESSER 1 and spending, ESSER 2 and ESSER 3. And then it gets, and that's the 90%, right? Then it gets into the 9.5 SEA set aside. And so that gives a perspective of public accountability. If we empower parents to take a look at that and be able to understand it, then they can ask questions that'll push our leaders to really think strategically and include stakeholders as they continue with this continual improvement plan that they have for their districts. And so absolutely agree with Jessica. It starts with data. One of the things that we've done internally is have an impact analysis tool, 6 questions that when we have proposals in our state that are going out to the 852 districts, we have to look at, we have to answer for the equity. But the other thing is making sure that in the deliverables in any contracts, you have student measures that are actually achievable, but also measurable, so that when you're talking to your vendors or your partners about, well, where are we in this, and what's the data that's showing that the students are growing. If it's not there, you need to have a process to end that, because the investment is not giving us what we want, and what we want is student learning. It's not a Ponzi scheme. It is really the lives of every student in Illinois and in our country matters. And so we have to make sure that we're data focused and we have systems and structures to go back to those conversations to keep each other accountable for what we're doing for the sake of our kids.
So Dr. Matias, you just mentioned something incredibly important that goes to the COVID constituency. We talked about this as a crisis, and we talked about this public will, and each of you has touched and focused, what each of you is focused on in personalized learning, teacher training, teacher preparation, tutoring, and so on, mental health. All of this is what the COVID constituency in various polls, surveys, focus groups is saying it wants. The one thing that the public is not as much aware of, though, is the fact that there are dollars that can, for the first time, really begin to build those structures that people are saying that they recognize they need. And that data that you talked about, and I put that dashboard, I think is incredibly important, because the success of this is going to be based upon how much public support there is for the policymakers. I spent a lot of years actually in advocacy in public life. It helps a lot when you feel the wind at your back and you're advocating something, as opposed to, I don't know whether anybody out there really supports what I'm doing. And so if we're encouraging people to be bold, that is policymakers and district leaders to be bold. I do have a question actually going back to a previous era. So are there learnings that from the previous race to the top, if you recall the recession of 2008, 2009, and 10, are there learnings from that, which was then the single greatest infusion of dollars into the education system, designed to both stimulate the economy, but also to help schools and districts be able to get through the worst recession since the Depression? Learnings from that have helped guide both the policy and the implementation of the ESSER dollars? Or am I just an old guy who, there goes Bob reflecting on the past. Let me just note one difference. There was the single greatest infusion. Jessica, I know you were around. We worked together on that one. But in a serious note, it was the single greatest infusion up to that point of dollars into states and districts. The difference then was not one school was closed. And of course, what we've just come through is the fact that at some point, almost every school was closed. Anyway, I'll turn it over to
I think there's definitely reflecting on which of those investments sustained beyond once the dollars and which ones didn't. And I do and how do you both spend these dollars with a sense of urgency, because we were going through a global pandemic, and be thoughtful and deliberative about it. I think, that was a different dynamic, but I do think, there had been prior experience with states of getting a large infusion of dollars, and where did we see that those investments sustained and where didn't they? And I would also think that the states, when they received those dollars, that some of those lessons might have informed how they went about spending those. I think the thing that's also, which we haven't talked much about, is the importance of family, educator, and community engagement in decisions around how those dollars are spent, and that they are meeting the needs on the ground, and that engagement needs to be, meaningful and ongoing to help inform that.
Jessica brings up a really important point that we all need to consider, right? When we went remote, parents were the educators at home, so I've had conversation with superintendents about including a professional development component for parents. We really have to include them here on out, because we never know what's coming up next and what the response is going to be. And so having parents truly as partners, I know that in some quarters, you don't like hearing about parents who are helicopter parents, but the fact of the matter is they are our first teachers. And this pandemic, if anything, has shown us that they can partner and collaborate with us moving forward. And so I think you make a valid point that we have to reconsider and at least have some parent engagement training components where we can include them at least on some of those things that they can do depending on their own experiences, right? So that they can partner and help us, educate their kids at home as well as volunteer at school.
And also to your point, what I've heard from a number of district leaders is that parent engagement went in the era of Zoom, parent engagement actually increased because one, they were very concerned about what was happening. And number two, they didn't have to drive across town or take time off from work to go to that meeting. But instead is there. I know. So maybe there's some things that came out of COVID that can be positive as far as parent and stakeholder involvement, which I believe is going to be increasingly crucial, and we're already and we're seeing that. In the time we have left, any points that any of you would like to make, particularly as we make about this period we're in, and suggestions that state district leaders might be following?
I think the only point that I'd like to quickly make is it's a time for healing. And as educational leaders, our talk, our role modeling to the community has to be filled with absolutely rigor, high standards for educating our kids, wrapped in compassion, love, and mercy. Our country is going through a big one, and we need people who are lovers, who are our listeners, especially since education is the key in our country, to be that reasonable when having difficult conversations on decisions that people don't like. And so my only thing is we have to learn how to put forth healing in our country while we have these difficult conversations, so that the kids see our modeling of, and then they too become healers in their lifetime.
Nick, any wrap up? Thank you, Dr. Matthias, for that message.
Absolutely. And I would just say that I think we are in it's such an incredible time for experimentation. And we're really learning on the fly what's being tried out there. And so that I think the great value is gonna come from keeping the spotlight on what different districts and states are doing, coming to webinars like this where we can try to share as much as we can from what we're hearing and learn from each other. And so the Hunt Institute, I know, is collecting a bunch of these best examples. There's a group called the Edu Recovery Hub, which is tracking these. Future Ed, which is at Georgetown, is trying to share different models. And so, yeah, so, this is going to be this, I think, definitive moment in education where, you've got 14,000 school districts all trying different things, and what great new models are going to come out of this. And so, please just continue to stay tuned and learn from one another and reach out when you can, and we'll continue to try to provide as much wisdom as we can and learn as we do it.
Dr. Carter-Shawn, bring us home.
No pressure. I think I'll kind of maybe marry what Nick and Dr. Matthias has said, right? That we know a lot about what interventions and strategies work around acceleration and tutoring and diagnostic assessments and SEL. And we also have to remember the relationships piece, how important that is for our students, particularly after an extended period of social isolation and disconnection, that we often, it is not hard to do, it's not easy to do policy making around relationships and building a sense of belonging. But with everything kind of going on in the world and what our students face, of listening to our students, empowering our students and their voices, and, making our focus on building and strengthening those relationships with our students as much of an importance as around the acceleration and all the other pieces. So it's been great. I think it was covered.
So thank you, and I'm going to turn it over to Jessica All in just a second. My concluding remarks is I've listened. I'm reminded what one district leader said to me is we need to be focusing on where we can work together to solve the problems that are coming out of COVID. And there are also now resources to work together to solve those problems. So I want to thank the Hunt Institute, and I will turn it over to Jessica All.
Thank you so much, Governor Wise. And thank you for moderating this conversation. I'd also like to thank again Dr. Matthias, Dr. Karshan, and Nick for joining us for today's engaging conversation. Before closing, I'd just like to take a minute to turn to our upcoming K12 webinars. Our next conversation will be on Thursday, August 18th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, where we'll be discussing how we can best engage parents and families in education at all levels, from the classroom to state and district level decision making. And so I know that's something we discussed a bit today. So we'll drop the link to register in the chat. So please go ahead and do that. We'll also encourage you to join us for our other upcoming K12 webinars listed on the screen. We have many coming up. And of course, this family engagement one is just in a couple of weeks. So we're really on a roll. So you can register for these discussions on our upcoming webinars page. And so thank you all again for joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon.